Hello, listeners. Hello, video viewers. Welcome to the podcast. Very nice to have you with me again. Now, as you know, in episodes of my podcast, I often talk about language learning, and I often teach you specific things like vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation, especially in the premium episodes, of course. But also on the podcast, I do episodes which are not specifically about the English language or about learning or teaching English. I also like to present you with things that I hope are simply interesting to listen to, or episodes which focus on culture rather than language. And this episode is one of those. This is a conversation which focuses on British culture and art. And it's an interview about an artistic movement which took place in England in the 1970s. So it's not about English, but it's all in English, of course, and I'm presenting it to you as part of your regular English listening practice. So this is an interview with artist, illustrator, and author Penny Dale, who was one of the members of the Bath Arts Workshop, which is the artistic movement that I'll be talking about with Penny today. So let me give you some context just to explain how this interview was set up, and this will not take 15 minutes, I promise. So first of all, there's a new book available, and it's just been published. It's called Bath Arts Workshop, Counterculture in the 1970s. And as the title suggests, it's all about a counterculture arts movement which took place in the southwest of England in the 1970s. We'll explain what a counterculture arts movement means in a few minutes. One of the people involved in that artistic movement, and also involved in the publishing of this new book, is Penny Dale. Penny is an illustrator and also an author of children's books, an award-winning author, I might add. She's illustrated and written some very popular kids' books in the UK, and we have a lot of them at home here. My daughter loves them. We read them all the time. But back in the 1970s, Penny hadn't begun that part of her career yet and was involved in this conceptual and subversive arts movement, the Bath Arts Workshop. Penny is a friend of the family. She's a very good friend of my mum and dad. And in fact, it was my mum who suggested that Penny could be a good person for me to interview, and that both the Bath Arts Workshop and her career as a children's author would be interesting things to talk about. So that's the plan. This will be two separate episodes, I think. This one about the arts movement, and then another one about the writing of children's books. So that'll be part one and part two. This is part one, of course, so let's focus on the Bath Arts Workshop. And by the way, listeners, Bath is a town in the southwest of England, right? We're not talking about bathtubs where you go to wash yourself and play with little yellow rubber ducks and boats and things. No. So this isn't an art movement that involved people sitting in bathtubs or anything. But then again, it was the 1970s, so, that isn't completely far-fetched. Anything's possible. Okay, so that's probably enough of an introduction from me. Let's now meet Penny and start the interview properly. So, hi, Penny. How are you today?
Hi, Luke. How are you? Looking good.
Fine, thanks. Except feeling slightly frazzled.
Oh,
That's an interesting word.
yes.
What's frazzled? Just slightly tired.
Frayed and tired and a bit distracted.
Yeah, just like a bit tired because yesterday at the weekend we went. Had a weekend away in the countryside, and that involved driving. And then we drove back, yesterday late afternoon. And it was supposed to be a 2.5 hour trip. And when you're using GPS or satellite navigation in your car, and
Yes.
the estimated time of arrival just keeps changing.
Getting longer, yes.
Yeah. So we were like 45 minutes away from home for about 2 hours is what it felt like.
Oh dear.
So it was a long car journey yesterday. So I'm feeling a bit frazzled, but I'm fine. How about you?
Yeah, more or less awake, I think, now. Yes, also had a really busy weekend as well. So I think I'm ready to try and sum up what the counterculture was, but it's not an easy ask. So
Yeah.
we'll have a go.
Yes, we'll give it a good shot. So let's talk about the Bath Arts Workshop. Let's go back to the 1970s in Bath, the southwest of England, a counterculture arts movement. Maybe we can start with that. What does that mean then, a counterculture art movement? I think we know what the culture part means, but what about the counter part? What is a counterculture movement? What do we mean by counterculture?
Well, I think it's an expression that maybe even started in America. I don't know, but it was around, the time of Woodstock, and also in London. There was an arts lab in Drury Lane in London. So there was a movement. It wasn't really the hippie movement. It was more a kind of came out of that and was people taking a position where they were saying there was a different way to do things than all out capitalism. There was a way that the arts could be used in a more kindly and productive way, with more people being included. So I think it was a movement about inclusion and countering the sort of elitism of a lot of art. So a lot of,
Yes.
classical music gallery going. And we're talking about Bath, the place, not the Bath, is a town in Somerset in England. And it became a kind of a hub for alternative, which is another word for this kind of culture and movement. So alternative technology as well as art. There just were lots of young people at the time. I think that it was the first time since the war generation, or the First and Second World War, that our parents were part of, were looking for an alternative and had time and an environment where they could experiment more. So there wasn't such a pressure it was possible to rent really cheap flats and things, and you could live. Students had grants that, they didn't have to pay back. There was just time and breathing space then to think of other ways of doing things. So, yeah.
So the counterculture part, as you said, is more about, trying to a movement that was sort of critical of the general current culture, especially in art, which, as you said, was quite elitist, and it was all about changing the general culture and finding ways of introducing new ideas that perhaps were critical of the current state of affairs, and doing this in inventive ways.
That's right. And just setting up actual physical spaces where everybody could join in. That was the sort of ethos. It was open to everyone, not expensive, accessible. Yes, inclusivity was the thing, and there were various all over this country and all over Europe and USA, all sorts of places. Young people were having these ideas, and movements were starting. So the workshop in Bath was just one. I encountered it early on, and it had sprung out of the London Arts Lab. Phil Shepherd, who was in the London Arts Lab, hitchhiked to Bath and had these ideas about wanting to do something like that in another place. And he'd written letters to councils all over the UK saying, can we start an arts lab where all sorts of people can come and try all sorts of things, from theatre and film and music. And, he just put this letter out, and in fact got a response from the council in Bath. It was probably the only one.
Hello viewers and listeners, I hope that you're enjoying this conversation. You just heard Penny there mention Phil Shepherd, who was one of the founding members of the Bath Arts Workshop. And after this conversation, Penny suggested that I might like to include a short video clip of Phil himself describing counterculture and explaining what counterculture means, because he does it in a very clear and concise way. So this is Phil Shepherd describing the counterculture, and this was recorded on video by Richard Wyatt, and the credit for this little clip goes to bathmuseum.com. But this is Phil Shepherd, founder of the Bath Arts Workshop, explaining what counterculture means.
What exactly was the Arts Workshop? We hear a lot about counterculture. Can you explain?
What the counterculture was? Yeah, well, I think the counterculture was a kind of reaction to, I would go as far as to say it was young people predominantly saying the kind of world that's being built in the shadow of the world wars, which was very, very prominent in those days, as you may remember, was not the kind of world they wanted, we wanted. We didn't kind of particularly see this kind of drive for materialism and prosperity and a kind of competitive environment as one that promised very much for us, I sense. So we were looking for alternatives. So to me, the counterculture came from a kind of deep, unconscious yearning for something different. And it manifests in a lot of different ways. At its heart, I think it was about compassion and kindness and collectivism and people working together. A thing about freedom that wasn't just about this notion of individual freedom, I'm all right, Jack, but actually freedom being a collective thing. But connectedness, I suppose, being connected to other people and connected to nature.
And Bath's a medium-sized, fairly touristy now city, but full of architecture, incredible Georgian architecture. So it's quite a special place, or a particular place. And it had a very classical festival there that used to go on every year with classical concerts and opera and literary stuff. So what Phil was wanting to start off, he and a friend called Abel came to Bath and just began, people coalesced